This lecture is on romantic piano music, and we're going to be looking at Robert Schumann, Frédéric Chopin, and Franz Liszt. A couple of things, we have spoken about Schumann before this, when we were talking about Lieder, but just so that you remember some of the facts about Schumann, his dates are 1810 to 1856. He was a German composer. Initially, he was studying law, and then but because his parents didn't want him to be a musician, and then he said he just couldn't do that, he needed to be a musician. So what happens is that he decides he's going to be a pianist, but he hadn't been actually studying piano, and he was in his teens. So what happens is that he goes and studies with Professor Wieck, who has a daughter, Clara Wieck, who is a very famous concert pianist, and he actually goes and studies with him, but he wants to make sure that his technique gets better faster. So what does he do? He creates this contraption, hangs it from the wall, and he actually exercises his fingers that way, and you can guess that he injured his hand that way, and that's the reason why he did not become a pianist. He did fall in love with Clara, but of course Professor Wieck didn't want a son-in-law that could make a buck, so he actually went against Schumann until Clara was of age, and at that point the courts were actually in favor of the two of them getting married. They had 7 children, and then all of a sudden, if you remember, Schumann starts to get the ringing in his ears, and when that happens, he throws himself into the Rhine. He ends up in the insane asylum, and then, of course, after that, he dies. In the meantime, it is Brahms, Johannes Brahms, that comes to live with them and helps Clara with the children. And when Schumann dies, he does ask for her hand in marriage, but of course Clara says that it was the only person for her was Robert. And so Brahms never married, and Clara Schumann never remarried. We know that during the time that Schumann was composing, he also was the editor of the New Journal for Music. This is very important during that time period, not because he would be criticizing the actual performances, but he'd actually be criticizing the works that were coming out, meaning that he would actually be a promotional agent for those works and those composers living during the time period, coming out with new works, because obviously if you didn't hear something live, you weren't able to hear it on a videotape or a recording or what have you. So therefore, he was very important to the time period, because we're lucky enough to have him to tell us what was good, what was not, what was going to be maybe in the future going to be something that we would be listening to even today. And if you look at his journal, you'll notice that a lot of the things that he did say actually came true, meaning that they were the composers that did outlive the time period, like Hector Berlioz and Johannes Brahms. The other thing about that journal, if you remember, is that when he would sign his journal articles, he would not sign his name. He would either sign Eusebius, which was more of the moody type of character, or Florestan, which was more passionate about what he was hearing. And then if he couldn't really make up his mind about something, he would use the character Master Raro. R.A. being in the end of Clara's name, R.O. being the opening of Robert's name, and also, of course, Master Raro would have been more of the teacher, like Professor Wieck. This is important because the very first piano pieces that I'm going to ask you to listen to, actually, you have the very famous Carnival, which is a piece that is made up of several characters. One of them is Eusebius and one of them is Florestan. So for the first time, we're having actually these characters not only be the pen names of Schumann, but actually how Schumann perceived them to sound. So I won't be asking you to listen to the very famous Carnival, which was a work by Schumann in 1834-1835. And he based this whole work, besides the fact that there are 2 characters in it, there are several others, a parade of characters, but there's Eusebius and Florestan. The other interesting thing about this work is that it's based on the letters ASCH, and they were actually the Ash was the place where his very first love came from, Ernestine von Fricken. Now, if you translate the letters from the word ash, you'll notice that they could be musical letters. For instance, AS could be A flat, S could be ES or E flat, H would be B natural. So therefore, it was the motifs that he created in this that are based on this word ash. Now, this is not something that he invented, because we've had other works from the past that use this same kind of using the letters of a name of a composer like Bach. So this is not something that's odd, but it's very interesting that what he picked were the letters ASCH for the town where his love, Ernestine von Fricken, came from. Now, the fact that this is all one piece and it has all of these programmatic elements, and it is for piano, it's this new form that becomes very important for piano compositions, and that's called the character piece. The character piece was like that lightning bolt of inspiration, meaning that a lot of times it was not a very long piece, or it was a piece that was very programmatic and actually told a story of some sort. And so during this time period, you're going to notice in the Romantic period, people like Schumann, Chopin, and even Liszt, kind of get away from the sonata per se as being the only way to express themselves in a piano work, a multi-movement work of a sonata. So this is basically a character piece, was just one piece of music that was programmatic, a lot of times very short. In the case of Carnival, much longer, only because it's a parade of characters. So I do want you to listen to the Eusebius and Florestan of the Carnival. There are other characters, but I did supply you a YouTube version of just these two characters so that you can hear what those two characters sounded like to Schumann, who was using those names to sign as pen names. The other work that I wanted you to know of, it was for Schumann, was again a set of character pieces from the Scenes from Childhood. Schumann really did like to use the character piece in his works because he was able to kind of give you this encapsulated version of a programmatic idea in a very short period of time. So from the Scenes from Childhood, which was 1838, we had the very beautiful Reverie. He also wrote the album for the young, which were teaching pieces, and again, they were short pieces, a lot of times from childhood ideas, the difference being that they were basically teaching pieces, whereas the Scenes from Childhood, the Reverie, is more of a piece that was more of a concert piece. So I'd like you to listen to it, because in your assignment, you might be choosing this as being able to give me some kind of a storyline that you can actually hear when you're listening to this piece, a programmatic idea, a poem, or what have you. you notice that it's very simple. It has an A section at the beginning that is repeated, and then it goes to the B section and comes back to the A section. Very much like a lot of the songs. A very beautiful melody too, and as you know, Schumann was very famous for his lieder. So that is the sometimes called Traumerei or the Reverie. The other composer that I wanted to address was Frederick Chopin. He was a Polish composer. He lived from 1810 to 1849. Unfortunately, he died of tuberculosis. Um, and he was in love with George Sand. George Sand was Aurore Dudevant. At that time, women writers a lot of times took a male personage for their pseudonym. In the case of George Sand, though, she even when you met her, she would be smoking a cigar, and she kind of had a lot of masculine qualities as to how she dressed and what have you. What happens is George Sand and Frederick Chopin decide that they're going to go to Mallorca, and when they go to Mallorca, of course, you got to understand that Chopin had tuberculosis, so therefore Mallorca is a place that rains a lot, so it wasn't a very good choice, but that's where George Sand wanted to go, and he was very inspired during this time period to write his preludes. Now, again, preludes before this, a lot of times a prelude would be followed by a fugue in the case of Bach, but in this case, the prelude became like a beginning. If you remember, like the Even the Lay prelude that we talked about with Franz Liszt, a beginning meaning that it was a moment or a lightning bolt of inspiration. So I would like you to listen to one of the preludes, one of the most famous of the preludes, which is the Prelude in C minor by Chopin. And you're going to notice it's very, very simple, and it also has very few measures in it, but it is a great example of a character piece. This is the Prelude in C minor, Opus 28, number 20. So you notice that there's all the chordal structures, and what happens is that when you're listening to it, you actually can notice that there's only a change in dynamics between the second section. And he really was trying to just give you a moment or a lightning bolt of inspiration as you listen to the character piece of the prelude. Now, what's very interesting is that Chopin wrote a lot of these character pieces, but he actually categorized them by certain characteristics, meaning that he has a set of waltzes, and as you can guess, a waltz would be where you would have it would be in three, the accent would be on the first beat, and the very famous one is the minute waltz, which was actually made very famous by the cartoons. So the Waltz Opus 64 number 1 in D flat, known as the minute, is what you will be listening to with the repertoire that's on Digication. Another set of character pieces was the mazurka, and the mazurka was based on the mazur, which was a Polish dance. It was more of a Polish folk dance, so therefore the accent wasn't necessarily on the first beat, a lot of times on the third beat, a lot of feeling of syncopation, and it has that like folk dance like feeling when you listen to it. Uh, I would like you to listen to the Mazurka Opus 33, number 2 in D major. Another category was the Polonaise. The Polonaise again was a dance, a Polish dance. And what we noticed is that the Polish dance, in this case, you're going to notice that a lot of times it had a rhythm in the middle for the Polonaise that we would actually so we would actually identify that in the middle of the Polonaise as being a characteristic of the Polonaise, that rhythm. So I want you to listen to the Polonaise Opus 40 in A major. You're going to also notice when you're listening to this, there's a lot of repetition because Chopin uses a lot of repetition, but his melodies are so strong that he actually carries it through, and so it remains very interesting even though it's a lot of repetition. You're going to also notice in the middle of the Polonaise you'll have that sense of it being kind of on the military side, and you'll hear trills that are being used, kind of like to give you the sense of the snare drum. Another character piece of Chopin's is the Nocturne, which is, if you want to identify it as a night piece, Opus 9, number 2 in E flat is the one that I would like you to know about. And this will be another one of those pieces that maybe you will choose to actually give some kind of a description as to what you're really listening to programmatically as you listen to this piece. You're going to notice a couple characteristics that I do want you to note in here is that you're going to have a bass line that's going to be basically a bottom note and then two chords, usually in an inversion. So you'll notice that that becomes the bass line. The other thing that is very important in this is because there's a lot of repetition, there's the use of what we call tempo rubato. Very, very important, meaning that there's this give and take or stealing of time. And that's because if it wasn't that way, it would sound very, very stick-like, meaning that we would not have that fluidity. So I would like you to listen to this very beautiful nocturne, and maybe this will be one of the ones that you tell me what you're actually describing as programmatically what you're actually hearing as you listen to this piece. So this is the Nocturne in E flat. It's the Nocturne in E flat. Again, a character piece by Chopin. The other thing I just wanted to mention also about Chopin, he himself was a pianist, but he would be considered a salon pianist, meaning that he would play in a very small room with a lot of people around him, not a recitalist like Franz Liszt. And the very famous, beautiful picture of Chopin is by the very famous artist Delacroix. So when you're listening to the works of Chopin, the one thing I do want to make mention in the works of Chopin is that in his one sonata of the B flat minor sonata, the second one that he wrote, he actually wrote the sonata in 4 movements. We would have expected it to be in 3, and it's programmatic. It's actually the first movement is birth, and then it's growth, and then the third movement is the very famous funeral march. Most people don't realize it was Chopin that actually created the funeral march. And the funeral march at the very beginning has the sense of the cart moving as the body is actually parading down the streets, and people are mourning. So I wanted you to know that he also wrote, the funeral march. For the third of these 3 composers that I want you to know about is Franz Liszt. He was actually more of the rock star of the time period, 1811 to 1886. He was a big player, very different than Chopin. As a salon pianist, he was more of a recitalist. He was very influenced by Niccolo Paganini, and I'm asking you to even read a little bit about Niccolo Paganini as well as the styles of Chopin and Liszt in the readings and make a comment on that. Niccolo Paganini just took the fancy of Liszt only because he was very flexible. He could do things on the violin that no one could do. And later on, they identified the reason why he could do all these things is because of this Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that he had, which was a syndrome of excessive flexibility. Franz Liszt had 3 illegitimate children with Countess d'Agoult. Cosima, one of his children marries Richard Wagner. Princess Caroline von Wittgenstein was also a very important person in his life, helped with a lot of his writings. You have to remember that Liszt did a collected writings, 9 volumes. Always the question is did he write them all, or did he have a ghostwriter like the princess to help him? He also wrote on Chopin as well as his own journeys and sometimes even the loneliness that he experienced as a musician, which seems to us very, very odd because he was such a rock star and people, when they saw him, like swooned or wanted a piece of his hair, or some of the countesses had like butts of his cigar that they would actually put in their bosom and would be found when they died. So you would think that he might not be a lonely person, but some of the writings are very interesting that way to show that even when he was not on stage, he had this sense of loneliness. He was a great improviser. We have stories of him actually competing, where someone in the audience would give him a small tune, and then he and another pianist would see what kind of improvisation that they could do to that tune. The other thing I do want you to know, he's considered to be the first recitalist, meaning he's the first one to actually play his works like on a large scale for big crowds. And he would perform from memory, which sometimes is a misnomer because I have a feeling that Franz Liszt really did not write his things down before he actually played them. The fact that he played from memory was the fact that he didn't have a piece of music in front of him. The other thing that was very romantic about Franz Liszt is after he had this incredible career as a pianist, he decides to become an abbé or a priest of the Catholic Church. And that's where we actually see his change in his music, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. He wrote character pieces, and they were nationalistic. The Hungarian Rhapsodies, because Franz Liszt was a Hungarian, he was a gypsy. Hungarian Rhapsody number 2 does have gypsy scales and thematic transformations. I chose the Hungarian Rhapsody #2 because it's been made very famous by a lot of the cartoons, and you'll recognize that when you listen to it. But the Hungarian Rhapsody is based on a recruiting dance known as a verbunkus. It was a Hungarian recruiting dance which had two parts, the lasso and the friska. The lasso was the very processional part where you kind of come out and kind of show off your wares, and then the friska was more of that very famous chardas where you would actually feel this the legs extending out, and what would happen is the friska would get faster and faster to see if you were able to be able to do it, to be sound and limb, to be able to keep up with that part of the dance. The other thing that you would notice is Franz Liszt uses a lot of repeated notes in his works, and we think that the reason why he does that is because he's trying to portray the cimbalom, or the from the Dulcimer family, which was a string instrument that would have been hit with mallets. What's interesting about that is that when you listen to Liszt's work, a little different than Chopin's, you always feel that he's orchestrating on the keyboard. He uses the entire keyboard, and he tries to create like an orchestral sense with his pianism of a lot of notes, a lot of ornamentation, and what have you. The other work that was very, very famous from Liszt's repertoire is the Totentanz. It's the Dance of Death. Now, why this is important to us is because we're used to having concerti that are for piano and orchestra. Here, this is a theme and variation, and guess what it's based on? The entire thing is based on the famous Dies Irae that we've known from Berlioz in with the medieval tune that came from the Requiem. So I'd like you to hear his rendition of this Dies Irae as he takes it through many, many variations. The other work that I do want you to listen to is the Concerto #1 in E flat. Sometimes it was derogatorily known as the Triangle Concerto because in the third movement he opens with a triangle solo, meaning that everybody has to wait until the triangle actually comes in. Being the concerto, it was for piano and orchestra, but different than the concerti of the past. First of all, he chooses for it to be 4 movements instead of 3, which you would expect, and also between movements 2, 3, 4, there is no stopping, so it's continuous movements. The other thing is that he doesn't have an entire double exposition at the beginning like we would expect. Remember the sonata allegro form with the double exposition where the orchestra plays theme 1, bridge, theme 2, coda. He does not have it because Franz Liszt could not sit at the keyboard that long without uttering something pianistically. The other thing that you're going to notice is that so you're going to have this little tune, and then he's going to come in with these crashing octaves. So what's interesting is at the very beginning also he begins with a cadenza, and we're used to waiting until the very end of the movement to actually create to have this cadenza taking place in a concerto. He could not wait that long. So I've assigned for you when you're listening to it my rendition of the Liszt piano concerto that I played with orchestra, so that you can listen for these various things that I've just spoken about. And the last thing I wanted to make mention of for Franz Liszt is the Via Crucis. As an abbé of the church, he starts writing church music, and the Via Crucis becomes very, very important because it's actually the Stations of the Cross, and it's written for mixed choir, soloists, and organ, and there's also a version for piano. What's interesting is that you can actually hear in the 14 stations, and it is a work that he goes from one station to the next, and it's very programmatic. It has the listing of the station so that you know where you are, that he actually devotes a movement to each one of the stations, and you'll actually hear the characters, meaning that you actually get an idea of a theme that's associated with Pilate, with Jesus, with death, with Mary, his mother. What's really interesting in it, you can hear various aspects of everything from the crucifixion, where he uses these big chords as though he's being actually nailed to the cross.